So welcome again, everybody from New York, frozen New York. Today we're very happy to have Bernhard Haeupler from CMU. Um, the the operator here helping me with this operation is Anindya De. And also behind the scenes we have Clément Canon helping, Gautam Kamat, and the two Thomases, Thomas Bidik and Thomas Hollenstein, helping everything behind the scenes. So maybe before we go with the talk, let's just quickly go around the table. As usual, this is a tradition here. Just introduce the audience. Anita, do you want to take over?
Yeah, I'll do that. Yeah. So we have K. Gopalakrishnan from East Carolina. Welcome. We have the group from Paris.
Anita, we just see you, so maybe you want to have them shown by clicking on their window.
Okay. We have the group from Chicago, TTI Chicago, Madhu Tulsiani. Is Madhu being shown on the screen?
Hi, Madhu.
Okay. We have the group from Caltech. There's Thomas. We have the group from UC San Diego.
I can't see everybody, but it's cool that so many people log in. This is awesome.
Okay, I am clicking, but somehow it's not transferring. I'm not sure what's going on. We have the group from NYU. Can you see him? See them on the screen? Because I am clicking the white box.
On screen. Okay, but people will believe us. There's a group from NYU here.
Okay. I just want to make sure that the speaker is seen.
I'm sure they're there. Yes.
Okay. Okay. And we have Shrikant. I'm sorry, I don't have your affiliation. Okay. And we have Jairam from IBM Almaden.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay, so back to that now.
And yeah, there's a group from Berkeley, maybe you mentioned. Okay, so thanks, Anindya. So before I go on, let me just mention that in 2 weeks we have the last talk of the fall, and that's going to be Mark Braverman from Princeton, telling us about Nash equilibria and ETH, the exponential time hypothesis. So that's going to be on December 3rd. Okay, so for today we have Bernhard Haeupler, and Bernhard is an assistant professor currently at CMU. He spent a year at the MSR Silicon Valley, former MSR Silicon Valley, a PhD he did at MIT with Jonathan Kellner, Muriel Medal, and David Karger. He's working mainly on algorithm design and analysis. Today he's going to tell us about interactive communication. I just should warn you that he's on the stock PC, so be nice to him, don't ask him questions or anything. So let's start. Thank you, Bernhard.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This is it's a great honor to be here, and it's great that so many people log in. I wish I could have seen everybody, but well, that's fine. So I know this is a hard medium to do, but if you have any questions, just unmute yourself and ask questions. It's a talk about interactive communication. It's supposed to be relatively interactive as far as the medium allows it. Okay. So what I want to talk about is something that has fascinated me at least over the last year, which is something like error correction for conversations. So on a high level, what I want to talk about is how can we make conversations robust to noise. And well, the title that I should have given my paper is really Coding for Interactive Communication Made Easy and Communication Efficient. If you search for the paper, it's called Interactive Channel Capacity Revisited. So this is mostly what this paper is based on. So let me just dig in quickly what's the problem definition is. I claim that for one-way communication, we know how to do error correction, right? And basically, this is just error correcting codes. So let's just revisit that quickly. In a very simplified setting, we have two parties. We have Alice and we have Box. My drawing skills are not very good. And Alice has some data. So let's say n symbols, think of it as n bits. And Alice wants to send these n symbols to Bob. So if the channel is clear, well, then she just sends it over. But the problem gets interesting once there's noise, right? So what if some constant fraction of the symbols that Alice is transmitting get corrupted? Let's say some epsilon fraction, epsilon, think of it as, let's say, 1%. Of course, in this case, Box really has no idea what exactly Alice wanted to send. Right? But we know what to do in this case, right? So in this case, we just send slightly more symbols, right? So we send, instead of n bits, we send 2n bits. So we get a rate of half. So r is some constant smaller than 1, and we send 2n bits. And now, if we use an error correcting code, it doesn't matter where these 1% of errors happened. Box will always be able to figure out what Alice wanted to send in the first place, right? And these things are incredibly useful, well studied. And so the basic questions that you want to ask about these codes are, what is the communication rates that we can achieve, right? How much do we need to blow up our communication to achieve this error resilience? And the next thing is computational complexity, right? So a random code will have very, very good error correcting properties, but implementing it would take exponential time. So the whole field of coding theory is about getting nice constructions of these structures, which allow us to do this computationally efficient. Okay, so this is a classical setting, but I claim it's really just for one-way communication. Right? You need a large number of symbols which want to go from one place to the other. So instead, what I want to, so let's see, what can we achieve here? Very roughly speaking, the rates that we can achieve for an epsilon fraction of errors, if the errors are exactly random, everybody knows we get a rate of 1 minus the entropy of epsilon. If the errors can be anywhere, if the interruptions are adversarial, then we are basically asking about what's maximum distance between code words that we can achieve. The exact answer is a big open question, but we have somewhere the GV bound and LP decoding bounds and other things. So the right bound is 1 minus some constant times h of epsilon, where this constant is, between 1 and 2, I suppose. And of course, in terms of computational complexity, we have also pretty much nailed it down. We can do it easily in near linear time. If we want to do it in linear time, we have to work a little bit harder, but near linear time, we can definitely do encoding and decoding. Okay. So now what I want to do. So what is coding for interactive communication? Well, it's really error correction for a conversation, right? So think of Alice and Box having a conversation. So Alice says something to Box, Box replies something, Alice says something back, and they go back and forth. And the easiest way to think about this is we have n rounds of interactions. In each of them, we send a single symbol. So either a symbol over a large finite alphabet or just a bit. So Alice sends a bit, Bob sends a bit, and so on. Now, if the channel is clear, then that's perfect. Then they can just have the conversation. But what happens if there's noise, right? What if you're in a noisy room and we want to have a conversation and some constant fraction of the symbols that we're sending back and forth will get corrupted? Well, obviously, we will have no idea how our conversation will go. It's going to be very hard to have a conversation. So the question is the same as in the error correcting setting. Can we make our conversation just a little bit longer? Can we add some redundancy to this conversation, which allows us that no matter where these corruptions happen, no matter how the noise is, in the end, we still will know exactly what our original conversation is about. Right? And this is what we call interactive coding schemes. And the question you can ask about these schemes is basically the same as for error correcting codes. So you can ask, how much do we need to blow up the conversation to achieve a certain error tolerance? Can we do this efficiently? You can also ask, what's the maximum amount of noise that we can tolerate? And maybe the first question, before going into all these details, is the first question that one should ask is this even possible? Right? And typically, when I tell this problem to people, there are either two answers. The first one is, well, this should be trivial. And the second answer is, that looks impossible. Okay, and both are not quite right, but both are very understandable. So let's maybe look at what exactly is the conversation, and why might this be hard, or what might be the first things that one would try. Okay, so here's a picture about what you should think of an interactive communication in a mathematical sense. It's just Alice at the top starts. She knows the answer to the first question. So for example, Alice and Bob want to arrange a meeting. So Alice asks, is it better this week or next week? Bob asks this, and Alice gives the answer, well, this week is best. Right? And then Bob says, okay, this week, let's meet on Monday instead of Wednesday then. Says Wednesday. Monday is good. Let's go to a restaurant. Bob says, I like Indian food. And Alice says, well, we have this great Indian restaurant around the corner. Let's go there. And so on. This is the conversation, right? Now, what happens if there's noise? Right? If there's noise, Bob might already misunderstand the first thing that Alice said, right? Or the second, third thing, whatever. At some point, a corruption happens, and either Bob really knows that something went wrong. Maybe it's so much corrupted that it completely misunderstands what the question is. So Alice says, well, let's meet this week, but Bob really understands next week, right? And then they arrange a different place, and the whole time Bob thinks we're talking about this week, Alice thinks we're talking about next week, and anything that they're communicating doesn't make any sense at all. The conversation takes a completely different turn. Any answers that they're giving have nothing to do with what the original conversation was about. Right? And if you look at this, so the first thing that one would try is, let's take each of the messages that were sent and apply an error correcting code to it, right? This is typically the reason why people think we know how to protect one-way communication. What is an interaction difference and a lot of one-way interactions? Well, the problem with this is, first of all, the messages might be very short. We only know how to apply error correcting codes to long messages. The second thing is, the corruptions can be such that a message is corrupted completely. And if you think about it, see, just corrupting one message, that's 1 over n in the number of total communication, if you have n rounds of interaction. So if you want to tolerate a constant fraction of errors, so it's the best that we can tolerate by protecting things message by message, is 1 over n. So this is really, really tiny. As the interaction gets longer and longer, this is the best we can do. Maybe at this point, good time. Any questions about the setup? Any questions about the problem? Any questions why this might be non-trivial to do? Nobody? Okay, perfect. So just protecting it message by message cannot do anything. Will not give us a rate that's or noise tolerance that better than 1 over n. So one needs to be something better, and it's not at all clear what. And so that's why the next reaction is this even possible? So the first one who showed that something is possible was 20 years ago. Schulman had this beautiful paper where he showed that some constant rate larger than 0 is achievable if the noise is smaller than 1 over 270, or less than 0.4%. Okay. And the way he did it, he came up with this really, really cool structural result. Tree codes showed that they exist, and built a complicated or a beautiful protocol around it. The problem with tree codes is we have no idea how to construct tree codes. Even by now, we can prove that they exist. We can't even give efficient construction of a tree code. Even if we had an efficient construction for a tree code, it would still not necessarily be clear how to decode from it. So everything that's in Schulman's paper is exponential time if you computationally. On the other hand, it works for adversarial noise. It doesn't matter where these errors are, as long as the errors are smaller than 0.5%, 0.4%, we can corrupt this. And if you think about this, this already gives also a result about random noise as well, right? Because for random noise, we can simply repeat everything that we want to send, let's say 10 times, and this really pushes down, and then we take the majority. Now, if the noise is random, then a symbol will be received with a much higher probability correctly. So we can push the noise rate really all the way down close to 0% as far as we want, by just running a constant number of extra rounds. This blows up our rate, but at least non-zero rate we can achieve for any random noise. This already also shows that somehow random noise is a whole lot easier than adversarial noise. Still non-trivial. So this was the start, and then I think it kind of got forgotten, and people didn't have any good ideas on how to improve this. And some 20 years, almost I guess later, Braverman and Rao dug this up, and it has become a topic of great interest since then. So there are plenty of works, starting with Braverman and Rao. All these works, I'm not gonna read them out loud. You can easily look them up, which improve on this. And basically, the question that we were all looking at is, what is the maximum amount of noise that we can tolerate? So can we beat this 0.4%, and can we do this efficiently? Right? And so after all this work, I think we have I know we have the right answers for this. So basically, the maximum amount of noise that one can tolerate is 1/4 at most. If it's 1/4, it's not doable. If it's 1/4 minus epsilon, the error as the noise rate, then it's not doable. If we insist that the protocol is, let's say, going back and forth, if it's non-adaptive. Of course, in reality, it's perfectly fine to adapt the speaking order, to adapt who is listening, who is talking, to what you think the noise is. You know, if you have a conversation with somebody and the line in one direction is a whole lot worse than in the other, you're gonna give this person more time to talk. In this case, if you allow adaptivity, we showed that you can achieve an error rate of 2/7, and again, this is tight. So this is the maximum amount of noise that one can tolerate with a rate that's constant and larger than 0. And beyond that, actually, the rate is exactly 0. Nothing is doable. And also exponential time computations, we improved over this as well and showed how to do things in near linear time. All these things still use tree codes, and they basically apply a lot of machinery on top of these tree codes to only apply tree codes to a very short protocols, and this allows to achieve more computationally efficient things. So this is perfect. There are, I guess, 2 drawbacks. One is everything is fairly involved. So in order to get the best rate and near linear time computations or efficient computations, one needs to start out with a list decodable protocol, which uses a special kind of tree codes, and then boost the efficiency and then turn it back into kind of a unique decoding protocol. Several steps, several of these papers by Braverman, Efremenko, myself, Mosen, and Madhu, myself and Mosen. All of these papers, you need to put them together, and they're fairly involved. And the second thing is each of these papers introduces another factor in the rate. These are all just constant factors, but the rate is going to be really tiny. It's going to be probably, I don't know, I guess it's 1/1000 if you're good, 1/1,000,000, depending on what parameters one is looking for. So it's really saying if you want to tolerate any kind of noise, just, you know, even sublinear number, a fraction of errors, still you're going to have to essentially repeat everything 1,000,000 times. It's a constant rate, but it's tiny. So so the obvious next question is, of course, error correcting codes. It's really important to know, you know, how close can we get to capacity? What's the trade-off between noise and communication rates that we can have? So the same question was here, and the first who actually managed to give some kind of results. It's a beautiful paper by Gilad Cole and Ran Ras 2 years ago. I forgot Stark or Fox. And what they showed, they only looked at random noise. But what they could show is that for random noise, if you have a fixed order protocol, so let's say an alternating protocol, and we simulate it in an alternating way, or in a fixed order, then we can achieve a rate of 1 minus some constant squared of epsilon log 1 over epsilon. Okay, 1 minus squared of h of epsilon. So if you compare this is a big difference between error correcting codes and the interactive setting. Right? If you have an error rate of, let's say, 1%, in the error correcting code setting, you need to obviously sense 1% and then a log of a 1 over epsilon factor more in addition. So this gives you 1 minus h of epsilon, or times some constant. Right? Here we get the square root. So instead of having to sense a 1% and a little bit of extra, you need to resend 10% and a little bit of extra. Okay, but what they could show is that this is the rate that's achievable, and they also gave a lower bound or impossibility result, which is obviously much harder. Takes up the bulk of the paper, where they show that for certain non-alternating protocols, so for not quite general, but for certain protocols, if you want to simulate things in a fixed order, this is the best one can do. Okay. So what I want to talk about today is basically going further along this line, looking at the rate of interactive coding. And this is also why the paper is called Interactive Channel Capacity Revisited. So we want to know what's the best rates that we can achieve with an error rate epsilon that's sufficiently small, because all of these have some hidden constant in here. And what we could show is that in the beginning was somewhat surprising. We can get a rate of 1 minus square root of epsilon, okay, for the random noise setting. So the log 1 over epsilon really should not be there. And initially, I didn't realize that there's a big difference between fixed order, general protocol, alternating protocols. All of this kind of fell together. So this seemed to contradict what Cole and Russ proved, which is never good, because you should never contradict Ran. But yeah, so it turns out that this order thing is important, and you can get this for general protocols as well, but you need to be adaptive. Okay, so what do I mean with you need to be adaptive? What I mean is, if you're not adaptive, then it turns out that a much stronger lower bound holds. So for the general protocols, fixed order, essentially settings that the KR lower bound or impossibility result holds, you cannot get something that achieves that goes to kind of 1% efficiency as the error gets smaller and smaller. You will always lose a constant. I don't quite have a formal proof for this, but a promise that it's true. So even if there's just a single random error or an erasure, I tell you exactly where this error is. If you insist on a fixed order simulation, efficiency that goes to 1, or you will lose a constant factor in your rate. Okay, so the nice thing is this does not just hold for random noise. It also holds for oblivious adversaries, which do not know your randomness or kind of commit to the places where noise happens before, or for computationally bounded noise, or if let's say the two parties share some randomness, right? So all of these things are somewhat equivalent. It's a much stronger setting, but in all of these settings, really the rate is 1 minus square root of epsilon. So this is the right rate. Somebody has a question?
Yeah. Can you tell us the difference between adaptive and non-adaptive settings here?
Yes. So in the fixed order simulation, it is clear, or I tell you beforehand who is talking at what time, right? So typically, let's say Alice talks and Bob talks, and Alice talks and Bob talks. It's alternating. Or I tell you Alice talks 3 times, then Bob talks 5 times. In the adaptive setting, it depends on what we've received, right? So in particular, if Bob has received a lot of errors, then maybe we want to let him talk more. Right? So it's not a priori clear who talks. And the model here is very simple. In each round, both Alice and Bob can decide whether they want to talk or not. If one of them talks, the other one listens. Well, then they hear what is going on, unless the adversary wants to corrupt what was sent. If both are sending, they're really just wasting the round because nobody's listening, right? And if both of them are listening, then it's unclear what they receive because they talk over each other, and we demand that the kind of the most stringent conditions that you can have. So basically, it's undetermined what they hear, and the protocol should work for anything. That's the worst kind of thing, and it turns out to be the right model. So, for example, in the error rates that we had before, right, the 2/7, we can prove lower and upper bounds that are matching for this model. So it's kind of not too strong on either side. Does this answer the question?
Yes.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, so I don't want to go too much into the. It doesn't actually pop up. It's not that important in these things, except that if you try to prove a lower bound and you pick kind of, if you pick a too strong model, then this is really the only the only place where it's kind of dangerous. If you want to have a general protocol and you want to you insist on simulating with the fixed orders, then bad things happen. The easiest thing to think about is kind of you have an alternating protocol to begin with, and then you can always simulate it in an alternating way. But it's nice to be able to simulate general protocols. But then it turns out you really have to think about adaptive protocols. Okay, so this is the setting for random for basically most noise models, except for the very worst case one, where we have a computationally unbounded omniscient adversary who gets to see all the randomness that you're sending out and can adapt to it. And in this case, we almost get a 1 minus square root of epsilon. So what we can get is 1 minus square root of epsilon log 1 over epsilon. Okay, so the log 1 over epsilon is also under the square root. As you can see, this is still better than 1 minus square root of h of epsilon, but it does lose this weird square root of log 1 over epsilon. Even though this all looks weird, I'm very, very convinced that these are indeed the right bounds. Right? So to just make this picture clear, I conjecture this is really what is going on almost always in almost any setting. One has a rate of 1 minus square root of epsilon, 1 minus some constant square root of epsilon. This is the best one can do, and this is easily achievable. And on the other hand, yeah, for this particular adversarial noise setting with no shared randomness, the log 1 over epsilon is actually necessary. Okay, and
question.
Yes.
So this bound, this is Jairam here. This bound is better than the one for one way, and that's just
no. It's worse. Right. So square root of epsilon. Epsilon is a number smaller than.
Oh,
1.
I see. I see. There's a square root there. I get it. Okay. Yeah. Sorry about that.
No, that's yeah, exactly. So there's kind of in the second order term in kind of how much extra you have to communicate. Basically, in the interactive setting, there's a square of what it's almost quadratically worse, the amount of extra stuff that you have to send to protect against errors. And I claim this is inherent. Okay. So yeah, so the protocol is the results that I want to tell you about is the first result for adversarial noise. It achieves the best capacity. It really also sheds a light on what these capacities are and why they look so weird. But personally, what I find most interesting about it is that they're extremely, extremely simple. Right. So if before I wanted to tell you how can I how is it even possible to do this, do error correction for conversations? And how can we make conversations robust to noise? And then I would need to tell you about tree codes and how to build protocols on top of it. And it would be nothing that I can explain to my mom, right? And this I can explain to my mom. Right? So this is, and this is why I really like it, and it's trivially computationally efficient. So here's the high-level overall idea, and you will see it's very natural. The high-level idea says, have our conversation as if there's no noise. Okay, so there's no coding at all. We just have our conversation. Obviously, there is noise, so at some point we might misunderstand each other. And just to make sure that our conversation is not going off into a wrong direction, becomes completely useless, what we do is every constant number of rounds, we just check whether we still agree on where we are in our conversation. So every now and then in our conversation, we just summarize, or we quickly give tell each other where we think we are in the conversation, and if we are at the right place, if we agree, we continue. If we don't agree, then something went wrong, and we just backtrack and try to find a point in our conversation where we did still agree. Right? Super simple. And ideas like this, backtracking, have obviously been used before. Schulman did it in his very first paper, 92 paper. Brakaski-Kalai builds on this. My papers with Madhu and Mosen do these kind of things. But the really important point is here, we don't do any coding. Right? So we just have the conversation as is, and it still works for adversarial noise. So,
Bernhard?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, quick question. What do you mean by check if in agreement? How you resend the whole transcript, or
yeah, so let's so this is a high level idea. So I'm gonna actually give so checking is gonna be done using hashing, and actually I will give kind of the mathematically precise flesh out of this high level idea on the next slide.
Okay, sure, thanks.
Okay, so yeah, so let's make this precise, because this is obviously not very mathematical algorithm description. So I'm gonna give you the whole algorithm and its proof of correctness and that it's fast. On the slide, I'm gonna do one small or not so small cheat, which is whoops. I'm gonna assume that our original protocol and the simulation are not sending each other, let's say, bits or a finite work over a finite alphabet, but let's say work over words. So what I mean with words is just we have log and bit size alphabet, and Alice sends one word, one symbol of log and bits, and then Bob sends one symbol of log and bits, and they go back and forth. This is both in our original conversation and in our simulation. And this makes things incredibly much cleaner, less technical as well, but it still carries over the bulk of the ideas that I want to show you. So this is why I do this cheat, and maybe I want to remark that I think it's a very plausible model. So if you look at distributed computing, log n bit size messages is always the minimum that they look at. So it's maybe a worthwhile model on its own, but if you're hardcore theorists, and I guess all of us, including me, are, then in the end we still want to know what happens kind of if we have a finite size alphabet. The ideas will carry over, but the algorithm becomes cleaner. So we are operating on words, and we have a block size which is going to be 1 over square root of epsilon. So think of the noise rate being 1%, and the block size is 1 over square root of epsilon of z. So square root of epsilon is 10%, right? So this is where it becomes larger, and then 1 over 10%. So we operate on a block length of 10 rounds. So here's the algorithm. We have a bunch of iterations. NOVB many plus a little bit of extra. NOVB simply because in each iteration we're gonna communicate a block. So in total we're gonna communicate for n times, and a little bit of extra as well, because sometimes we have to backtrack. And in each of these iterations, we just carry the conversation forward for B rounds. And we keep a transcript where in my transcript and your transcript, we're both writing down is in round 1, Alice said this. In round to Bob says this, right? So we're just writing down what we think is our conversation so far, and we do this for, let's say, 10 rounds. After 10 rounds, we want to check that we're still on the same page. So what do I mean precisely with checking? Well, both of them sample a log n bit seed, S, fresh randomness, they just sample it for themselves. And then what they do is they hash their transcript. So they take this hash function, which is defined by the seed, and they hash their entire transcript. So the transcript is order n long. So they compute this hash, and what they send over to the other side is the seed, is the hash value, and the length of the transcript. Okay, we will see why we need the length of the transcript. So in total, this is just log n bits, right? So the hash function, the seed is log n bits. The hash is the hash output will also be log n bits, and the length information is never longer than log n bits. So I can put this into one symbol and send this over, into one word, send this over. And similarly, from the other side, I receive the his seed, his hash function, and his length. Of course, these things might be corrupted or might not be corrupted. We don't know. Okay, and then what we do is we just check whether our views coincide. So in particular, I take the hash value from the other side. And this is supposed to be the hash of the seed S prime applied to the transcript. So I apply it to my version of the transcript, and I check whether it matches. If it matches, I'm already done, right? If it matches, then I assume that everything is good and we just continue. If it does not match, then apparently we have a discrepancy. Apparently something went wrong. We have a different transcript, or something was corrupted in the transmission. And then what I do is I check whether my transcript is longer than yours. And if it is, or if it's equally long, then I backtrack. And what I mean with backtrack, I just remove 3 blocks from the transcript. So I remove the last blocks that we added, and let's say 2 extra blocks, and I just go back. Okay. Any questions about the algorithm so far? I heard someone.
Yeah, what type of hash functions should these be? So should these be cryptographic hash functions, one-way hash functions, collision-free hash function, anything?
Collision-free. Yeah. So it's just what I want is if the transcripts are different, then and I choose a random seed, then the hash output is going to be different with probability. Here it's going to be exponential in the output length, so 1 over poly n. We don't need it quite as strong, but yeah. So I just want that if you take 2 transcripts and you sample an independent seed and you hash these 2 transcripts, these 2 strings of, and they're different, then you'll catch it with good probability. Nothing here is cryptographic because we have a computationally unbounded, all-powerful adversary. Does that answer the question?
Yes. One more silly question. Here in this slide, you are using T with the same letter with 2 different meanings, right?
And no.
The repeat T equal to N over B.
Oh,
right?
Yes. So
just
yes.
making sure, that's all. No problem.
Oh, I apologize. Yeah. So it should really be, yeah. So first T is the number of iterations, and it should not be T or yeah. So the transcript should be T, and we hash the transcript. So anything but the first variable is the transcript, and the first variable is just a counter. So yeah, very good catch. Very confusing. My apology. Okay, so this is the algorithm. I think overall it's.
We have another question.
Yes.
It looks like because you only have the condition if L is greater than or equal to L prime.
Yes.
So one person backtracks. What does the other person do?
The other person, I think the most intuitive thing to do is just remove the last B steps and do nothing. You can also just leave the last the last B rounds. So the other person does nothing in this description here. I find it a little bit, it's easier to think that if the hashes don't match but your length is not longer, you just discard the last B rounds. I didn't write it because it's shorter this way. Maybe I should.
So then they're no longer synchronized in where they need to start?
Very good. So they will not be synchronized. And actually, the reason why we compare, they might anyway not be synchronized because if only transmission one direction gets received, it might very well happen that one person backtracks and the other person didn't know and just goes forward. So I think, yeah, so they will not be synchronized. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
So let's, so I claim it still works, and I will prove it to you. And I think the only thing maybe that's not quite clear, I think overall the algorithm is fairly intuitive, right? I mean, it's maybe not intuitive that it works, but the algorithm itself should be intuitive. The only thing that's maybe not quite intuitive is why do we compare the lengths? Why don't we just have both sides backtrack if there's a collision? And the reason why we do this kind of length coordination or depth coordination is more or less exactly what you said. So we might definitely become out of sync, right? So this is a picture of how the conversation is. One person is there, the other person is there. At some point they diverge, and they might be at different depths. So if at this point we kind of both backtrack 3 steps or whatever it is, then everything is fine up to the point where we're already on the same path, but one person is still deeper than the other. Now, if here we would not compare our lengths and would both backtrack the same number of steps, you can see where this is going, right? We would always remain unsynchronized, even if nothing bad happens, and we would unravel the whole conversation. So this is why we compare the lengths. I will continue with the proof for why this algorithm works, unless somebody thinks there's another question that's good to ask right now.
Bernhard?
Yeah?
I guess another thing you could do, which would obviously be very bad, is just to go to time L prime. Like if you hear the other party is a time L prime, you backtrack all the way down to L prime. That would be very bad.
This would be very, yeah. So this it's maybe intuitive at first, but it's very bad, in particular because if the adversary gives you a bad L prime, it just needs to corrupt a single round and has you jump back a really long jump to the beginning, for example, if you trust this L prime. And so with just a tiny, tiny error, it can produce a lot of damage, and that's why it's a bad idea. Right? Okay, so so here's maybe an intuitive reason why this algorithm works. Think of the error rate as being tiny, 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 right? And our block length is also tiny. Our block length is, you know, some constant number of rounds, but it's much, much smaller than it's much, much smaller than the inverse of the error rate. So think of an error rate of 1%. Only 1% of the transmission can be corrupted, but each block is of length 10, right? Square root of that. Which means that most blocks will work as they are, and only a very small number of blocks will have a corruption in it. And because good blocks without corruption, make progress, versus bad blocks can't unravel too much of progress, this will actually work. So this is the intuition. Turns out that we can also make this very precise. So here's the mathematical way of making this precise. We define potential, which is more or less exactly what I said. So if you have a conversation where we agree up to some point, this is our transcript, and then our transcripts disagree, what I'm going to say the potential for this situation is the number of blocks which we agree minus the number of blocks that we disagree. So on this, the picture is kind of very small, but I hope you can see it. So the red part here is a total length and number of blocks of the red part is the negative potential, and everything that we agree is positive, and the negative, of course, because in the end we need to backtrack. So this is, you know, these are the parts where we need to backtrack, and the black parts is actual progress. So this is our potential, and now I claim the correctness and the fact that it's fast is captured by the following 2 simple claims. First claim is if you have an iteration in which no hash collision and no error happens. So hash collisions happen so infrequently, sub-constant probability, that we can essentially treat them like an error. So we just increase the number of errors a little bit. So if you have an iteration in which no error happens, then I claim our algorithm does something good. In particular, it increases this potential by at least 1. Right? that's easy to check. So if we have, if we are at the same point, then we will continue both our conversation from the same point, and there's no noise in this block, so in this iteration. So we will have the conversation in the right way. We will send our hashes, and obviously the transcripts agree, so we will not backtrack at all. And we've just increased the number of blocks on which we agree by 1. On the other hand, if we're in a step where we disagree, then both of us will continue the conversation for B blocks, but at least one of us will afterwards backtrack and unravel some of the errors that we did. In particular, it's a deeper one because again the length and the hash functions will get over to us uncorrupted. And in this case, again, kind of we decrease the number of blocks on which we disagree, and therefore we increase the potential by 1. Right? So if no error, no hash collision happens, we make progress. On the other hand, any iteration, and it doesn't matter how many errors are and what these errors are in an iteration, cannot decrease our potential by more some constant. Right? And that's also that's why we don't want to jump back to L prime. This would not hold for jumping back to L prime. Clearly, even like the worst we can do is walk forward 1 in the one direction or backtrack 3, even so we should have not backtracked. So I think it's very clear to see that we cannot decrease the potential in one round, in one iteration, by more than a constant. And yeah, that's claim 2. And if you put those two together, and the fact that there can't be too many bad iterations, we get correctness. So in particular, if you look at the final round, right? So if you look at the round n over b plus 5 n epsilon, this is how many iterations we run. Each of these iterations, and here the t is the number of iterations. So really this t and this t should be an I iteration count. So in each iteration, we make by default 1 step of positive progress on the potential, unless it's a round with an error, in which case, instead of going 1 forward, we go 3 back. So for each of these rounds, we get a kind of negative potential of 4. And how many can there be? Well, we don't run for longer than 1.1 n rounds. Right? I mean, the rates that we have is going to be 1 plus some subconstant term. So it's at most, let's say, 1.1 n, and there's an epsilon fraction of error. So in total, at most, a small fraction of these rounds can make problems. And since we have 5 epsilon n here and 4.4 epsilon n here, the total potential in the end is at least n over b. But the positive potential can only come from the blocks on which we agree. So this means we agree at least on n over b blocks, which really means we really agree all the way up to the end. And therefore, this protocol is going to be correct. Okay. This is correctness. Maybe maybe there are questions before I go into the rate. No? Well, that's perfect.
Actually,
yes.
So can you say intuitively how you get squared epsilon? So if we have 1% error, can you say?
Yeah. Yeah. So this comes. So the epsilon squared of epsilon comes in the rate, and so this is here. So let's look at the rate, right? So the rate is basically just originally we had n number of rounds, and now I want to know how many rounds does this simulation take. Well, we can just calculate this. We have n over b plus 5 epsilon n iterations, and each of these iterations has b plus 2 rounds, right? So let's just multiply these together. What we get is a factor of n by multiplying the top terms, and then we get some constant times. So what are the lower order terms? The constant terms times the epsilon n term is the epsilon times b term, and the 1 over b term times the constant is the 1 over b term, right? So get n times 1 plus epsilon b plus 1 over b. And now, well, I already told you how to set b, but usually, of course, we would leave b as large as, we would, well, C, we would determine B, and you can already see we want to optimize this term, epsilon times B plus 1 over B. And it's very easy to see that in order to minimize this, in order to minimize the overhead, we want to choose, the optimal way to choose this is to choose a block length as 1 over square root of epsilon. And maybe a little bit, like, let's talk about it a little bit more, especially because you asked, so what are these terms intuitively? Well, the 1 over B term is just saying that every B rounds, we're introducing a constant number of symbols, so in this case, 2 extra rounds of redundancy. This is going to cost us in weight, obviously, right? And it's going to cost us as a 1 over B factor. If every B rounds, I introduce 1 round of redundancy, we lose 1 over B regardless of how many errors happen, just for sending this extra checking. On the other hand, if I make my block length, so in this case, I want to make my block length large because then I introduce fewer checks. On the other hand, every error that's going to happen is going to cost us at least 1 block. And this analysis shows it costs us at least some constant number of blocks. So every error costs us a B number of transmissions, and there's an epsilon fraction of errors. So the loss due to kind of having to backtrack and having to not catching an error right away, but having to backtrack is epsilon times B. And of course, as we make the blocks longer and longer, this cost becomes more and more. And the optimal trade-off is, well, exactly kind of square root of epsilon, right? Trading, yes, there's somebody with a question.
So maybe another question, Madhur just asked a question. When you define a potential function, the number of blocks on which they disagree, is that just for the farthest player, the further down, or both of them, like the sum of the path?
Any of those work. I mean, they're really just some constant factors far apart, right? The maximum versus the sum of them. I think I did it with the sum. Yeah, it doesn't matter. It will probably change the constant here, and actually with the 3 steps removal, I'm not even sure if I calculated that constant is 3 here exactly. But yeah, so just the length and number of blocks, either of the maximum or of the sum of them, both of them will work. Okay, let's see. So this is kind of the main parts that I wanted to get to. Are there questions about this? Because anything I will say after will kind of not make sense if this is not clear. Okay, perfect. So yeah, so this is basically this on a very high level is the is all one needs to do. It achieves a rate of 1 minus square root of epsilon, and this is actually the full proof, the full protocol. Nothing really hidden for the case that we're operating on words. So for the rest of the talk, there's not terribly much time, maybe some 10-15 minutes. We started a little late. I will, for everybody who's kind of interested in digging deeper into the technical details, talk about what extra things we need to do to bring this down to a finite size alphabet, to let's say bits, and kind of why there kind of the technical fun starts. But for words, this is the truth and the whole truth, I suppose. Okay, so why can we not just run this algorithm? And yeah, so I also will speed up a little bit technically, so I hope to kind of satisfy the people who know a little bit about this stuff and want to learn the gist of the paper. So why can we not apply this protocol to a finite alphabet, right? So the biggest problem is what we did here is we send log n bits, and we can put them in one symbol because, well, I defined the symbol length to be words, which is log n bits, right? In a finite symbol alphabet, we would need to put these log n bits into multiple symbols. We would need to put them into order of log n symbols, and then our block length becomes way too large, right? So the biggest problem of bringing this kind of to a finite alphabet is that the adversary can force us to have a very large divergence, right? So the adversary can easily kind of play the guy in the middle for an epsilon number of rounds and have one of us run in one direction, the other one in another direction, or backtrack, or whatever he wants to do. He has the full power. But on the other hand, we really can only use constant number of bits for checking. If we use anything super constant, we will lose in rate. If you lose more than 1/epsilon bits for checking, then our block length becomes larger than 1/epsilon, and then every single block can have an error, and we're dead in the water. Right? And so these problems actually look quite severe. And if we look into so algorithms, there are at least kind of 3 points where it looks like this login is provably needed. And I suppose this is also the reason why, this is such a simple protocol. People have thought, I've thought really hard about these questions, and it took a while to come up with it. And the reason why this just doesn't look like a good idea for constant alphabet is because there are at least 3 reasons why it looks just plain impossible. Okay, so let's think a little bit about it. There's 3 places where we need the extra login bits. One is the seed length, right? So we use login bits of randomness. And why do we use that much randomness? Well, first of all, we want the hash collision probability to be small, but maybe we don't need it to be quite that small. But the real reason is we're hashing order n long strings, right? So 2 strings can be order n long, the divergence can be really large, and we can't just hash the last few things, because the adversary can hide an error n/epsilon many steps up in the protocol and then have us perform as everything is normal. If we don't go back and check this as well, then we're in trouble. So we need to hash strings that are of length order n, and it's very easy to see that you need at least login bits of randomness to do this. Otherwise, there will be strings which will always map to the same thing, right? So seed length is one place. Depth coordination is the next one, right? We really need to find out who of us is deeper. If the only thing we can do is find out whether we're in agreement or not, we will not know who of us should backtrack. And if we both backtrack, or if we both behave symmetrically, we will never catch up in the synchronization. So we really need to know who's deeper and who is not. But then our length difference can be, again, order n long. How can I compare who's deeper, who's not, who has a larger number, if the numbers are order n large, and we don't want to send actual length information, because length information would be log n bits. Next place of trouble, and maybe the last bit of trouble, is hash size. So we send the seed, but we also send the hash itself. And if we have really just a constant number of bits independent of epsilon, then we get a constant fraction of errors independent of epsilon. And it looks like this might produce too many hash collisions compared to epsilon, right? So one can choose the output to be log 1/epsilon, then one gets a kind of collision rate that's polynomial in epsilon, but this would lead to a rate of square root of h of epsilon instead of square root of epsilon, and we really want to get square root of epsilon. So 3 places where we really want constant size hash information, constant size hashes with constant number of bits and no depth information to make this work. Question about any of these 3 kind of problems before I quickly sketch out some solutions.
So, in some sense, as long as I want to send you a message of length log n, then I'm not so worried. I can do error correction, and if the adversary wants to corrupt, the adversary has to pay for those log n bits. The issue is mainly with small messages being exchanged, right?
Not so sure. So if the message, so it's a symbol size or the message size?
Okay, maybe I should keep it for later. Maybe it doesn't make sense. Yeah. I'm just saying, if I want to send you log n bits.
If the original protocol is Alice sends log n bits and then Bob sends log n bits, but they send these bits one by one?
Yeah, so if in, say in the original protocol they send blocks aside login, then it's essentially the same setting you had before, right? You could, by error correction, right?
Yes, so this would kind of give a solution if you want to blow up the communication by a factor of log n.
Yeah, but that would be terrible, of course.
Yeah, I mean it's a rate of 1 over log n, and I suppose if the original protocol operates in one person sending log n bits, the other person sending log n bits back, and we are fine with our simulation to kind of have more rounds of interactivity, maybe one could do something. But yeah, so maybe let's take that offline. So for general protocols, yeah, so the problem is always kind of large number of interactions, small messages.
So Madhur also asked, can one think of the login block as a login round protocol, and he cares?
So I need to think about it, but I think yes, we can kind of reduce. So we can make a block of size log n and use an error correcting code, but we can't really compress number of rounds of interaction, right? So so it would give, I mean, like all of this is possible, but it would give a rate of 1 over log n. So it would give a sub-constant rate.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so so what we really want to do is kind of use very small number of bits for randomness, for the hashes, for the hash output sizes, and don't coordinate on the defs. And so here are our solutions to these problems, at least kind of quickly sketched out. And for the details, I'm afraid you're gonna have to look at the paper. So for the seedlings, what we do is for the randomness, really what we do is we share some randomness a priori, right? So it's easy to see that we can share, for example, let's say it's square root of epsilon bits of randomness, but just Alice sampling it, putting it into an error correcting code, and sending it over in I guess we can even share up to epsilon n bits of randomness by using error correcting code and having 10 epsilon n transmissions to send these over. Or even if square root of n is larger. Another, is there somebody else having a question?
Yeah, so this would be, I mean, you have more now. You have square root epsilon times.
Yeah, so right, so we can pre-share even square root of epsilon many bits, and this just takes kind of square root of epsilon n amount of communication, so we would still be, our rate would not suffer from this, so we can essentially assume that that we have some square root of epsilon bits of randomness, and also because the adversary cannot introduce more than epsilon n many errors, if we have an error correcting code of, let's say, just distance half or distance some constant, we will always be able to decode on the other side correctly. So shared randomness is not really a problem, except that it's not enough, right? So usually we would have n rounds of interaction. In each of them, we would like to use log n bits of randomness. So this is n log n bits of randomness that we would need. But what we can do with this is we can just use a PRG, a pseudo-random generator, and stretch the randomness. So it turns out that in our protocol, maybe not that surprisingly, we don't need full independence for everything. We need a large amount of independence, but not an overwhelming amount of independence. So what we can do is we can use approximate limited independent sampling spaces and use these square root of epsilon n bits to get randomness that's almost as good as get n log n bits of randomness that's almost as good as full independent randomness and good enough for our purposes. So I guess that's a fairly standard trick and fairly easy. There's one big problem, right? So the problem is, especially in the adversarial setting, if I pre-share my randomness and I send it over the channel, then the adversary knows this randomness. Now, if I want to use that randomness to hash our transcripts, that's a that at least looks like a super bad idea, right? Because it's very easy to produce hash collisions if I know which hash functions you're gonna use, right? So in our protocol, we really made use of the fact that the transcripts that we hash, the seed we sample afterwards and independently. So the adversary first needs to commit to its corruption, and then we sample a seed to try to catch it. Here we're now saying I sample the seed, tell it to both my other partner and the adversary, and now I use it for hashing, right? So for an adaptive adversary, this looks really bad. What saves us is that in the end, we can basically do something like a big union bound over all adversaries. So we can prove that if the adversary runs a fixed strategy, if the adversary is non-adaptive, then it doesn't matter whether I appreciate the randomness or not. In this case, I get a success probability or a failure probability, which is absolutely tiny, and it's exponentially tiny, right? And the number of adversaries, on the other hand, is also exponential, but it's smaller. So in the end, I can take a union bound over all possible adversarial strategies, each of them failing with an even smaller probability. So the total union bound sums up that no matter which adversary, which strategy he runs and picks adaptively, it will still fail with a large probability. And you can already see kind of the number of adversaries that are there is, well, there are order n rounds of interaction, epsilon n of them, or order epsilon n of them can be corrupted. So this is, roughly 2 to the epsilon n many different adversaries. If I can prove that my protocol is successful with a probability or failure probability smaller than the inverse of this, then I'm done.
Bernhard?
Yes.
Wouldn't you expect to have many more adversaries? Because the adversary is really a function from the transcript so far to the next bit, whether to corrupt the next bit or not. So it's not just, an adversary is not just a subset, but it actually depends on the communication so far.
Okay, so the adversary, I guess, so two things. The adversary fixes the function or the protocol that we want to simulate, but this one, we want to work for all functions. So this one gets chosen in advance, and we sample our randomness afterwards. So that's good. And then, yeah, so the adversary can kind of depend on the whole transcript, but that's not the most elegant way of counting it. In the end, kind of the phenotype of an adversary, or kind of what the adversary actually does, is it chooses some number of rounds to be flipped. It chooses an epsilon n many rounds out of n to be flipped. This is the only thing that kind of it learns a little bit about the protocol, and then it gets to pick out this one of these set of actions. Even if I tell the adversary all the randomness in advance, the best he can do is pick one of these sets of actions. I mean, one of these set of positions. And what I will show is that even if I give him all the randomness in advance, if each of these set of actions, each of these positions which he can corrupt, is going to be unsuccessful with high probability, and with such a high probability that, in fact, with a still high probability, there doesn't exist a single set of actions that he can choose, even if I tell him all the randomness and everything that's going to happen in advance, that he can choose to make this thing fail.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah? Okay. Running out of time more or less, so let me just go to maybe a quick thing about the hash size. Here we exploit that hashing only makes a one-sided error, right? In the sense that if we have two transcripts that agree, well, then it doesn't matter how stupidly I choose my hash function. See, I apply the same function, and the output will agree, right? So hash collisions can only really happen if the transcripts are different. But just by the fact that our protocol is very communication efficient means that most rounds must have a matching transcript, right? Which means in most rounds, I don't even have the chance to make a mistake. And in fact, if so adaptivity again is a problem. I won't really go into this. This is kind of one of the places where the log 1 over epsilon comes in. But if I look at it, kind of what happens is, even if I have a probability of some constant probability better than 50% of catching a mistake when it happens, catching a non-matching transcript when it happens, most of the time the transcript are the same and it doesn't matter. Then the adversary introduces an error, and at this point we might make a mistake. So with constant probability we run into the wrong direction. But at least with constant probability we run into the correct direction. And in total, I'm kind of doing a biased random walk towards going back to 0. The expected number of rounds that I waste on this walk is just a constant. And again, one needs to be careful with this big union bound and the tail probability to show that the adversary can not choose a point in our random walk in which we take long over something else. So if it's non-adaptive, then we're fine. If it's adaptive, one again needs to use this big union bound argument. And there is the problem of doing the length coordination. This one is less technically interesting. It's actually kind of the most work of making it work. But the gist is we can get a safe estimation of how far we are apart. This is where the main work goes in. And once we know roughly how, by just keeping kind of a counter of how many rounds we detected a mismatch of hash functions but couldn't correct it. And once we have a safe bound on how far we are apart, one can use an idea that goes back to Schulman's very first paper and define meeting points of the appropriate distance and try to compare the matchings as the hashes of these meeting points to meet in one of these meeting points. So I won't go into this. Quickly, if there are any questions to this, let's do that now, and then I will summarize what we did in the talk and wrap up. Any questions? I'm aware that this was fairly quick and not as detailed as the rest of the talk. I guess the important take-home message, the important thing to take away is that yes, all of these log n bits that one needs to share are a problem, and it's not clear a priori how to get rid of them, but one can. And this is kind of where the more technically interesting things happen. But I think it's conceptually it's somewhat less interesting because the overall the thing is so clean, and these are some details that are important that one can take care of them. But I'm telling you, one can, and I think the paper is written quite well. So all of this is also explained in the paper. So no questions, and I just wrap up. So just a quick summary. So what I showed you is a new interactive coding scheme, and what I like particularly about it is it's very simple. I think it's very intuitive, right? Have the conversation as if there's no noise, and every now and then check whether we are on the same page. If not, backtrack. I think this is probably relatively close what happens in real life, maybe. It doesn't use any coding. It's a first adversarial scheme that doesn't use tree codes. It doesn't actually use any coding at all, unless you consider hashing some kind of coding. It's straightforwardly implementable efficiently. The only thing that we do is hashing. If you think about it, we have n rounds in which we have hash transcripts of length order n. So the really straightforward implementation would be, I guess, quadratic time, but using ideas that we already applied in various places, Brakaski now, or a paper with Mosen, one can get it in near linear time, and it's much easier here. It's really fairly straightforward to get it in also near linear time and polylog. You can think of this result as kind of reproving Schulman and anything that makes it efficient afterwards. So in particular, it also shows that there is some constant error rate, and it's going to be better than 1 over 270, for which we can get a simulation that has constant rate. It doesn't quite get the maximum amount of noise that one can tolerate, but that's maybe not surprising because, for example, it works for the binary case, and we don't even know what's maximum error rates that we can tolerate in the binary case. It's somewhere between 1/8 and 1/6, as we showed recently. But so it shows that for some not too small constant error rate, one can get a nice rate. But it's also communication efficient, and it's the first communication efficient scheme that works for adversarial errors, which are obviously much harder than random errors, and also the first one that works for general protocols if one allows to be adaptive. And one thing that this also shows is that adaptivity is actually required for non-regular protocols. So general protocols we cannot hope to simulate without being adaptive. And the communications rate, I conjecture them to be optimal. So the right error rate in almost all settings, as what I would call the capacity, even one needs to be careful how to define it, 1 minus some constant times square root of epsilon, random errors oblivious if we share randomness, and so on. And a log 1 over epsilon comes in for the fully adversarial setting. Both should be tight. And maybe less interesting, but kind of just to say that this is an important distinction to make. If we have a fixed order simulation, but you have a general protocol, then it's not possible to have an efficiency that goes to 1. So one will always lose some constant factor in the rate. Whereas here, if the noise is small, in all of these results, the rate gets close to 1. If we assume fixed order simulation and general protocols, then this is not possible, even just for a single erasure. And of course, there are plenty of open questions. So one is obviously one that I'm very interested in, to actually prove these conjectures. So I know the high-level reason why they are true, but proving impossibility results on communication is obviously much harder. Cole-Rusk gives a great framework. It's not quite easy, but proving these conjectures certainly would be a nice thing. Then there's a multi-party setting, the network setting. A bunch of works have been done, but there's definitely space for more. And one can also look at different channels. So one, for example, can look at erasure channels or channels with feedback. So these particular 2 channels we've looked at, turns out they're much easier. There are 2 papers coming up at SODA and ITCS with Ran and Klim. And so one thing that's interesting is that these rates do not hold for, let's say, erasure channels. So it turns out that for erasure channels, one can get a rate which is 1 minus some constant times edge of epsilon. So no square roots there, and it's essentially the best rate. It's the same rate as in the one-way setting. That's pretty much all I have to say. Thank you guys so much. Thanks also for all the questions. This worked very, very well, and I had a lot of fun in this talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernhard.
Thanks for that.
So if there are any questions, now would be a good time, and we'll those of you who want to stick around later, we can ask you questions also once we go offline. So any questions now before we go offline? So let me mention just before we go offline, that those of you who want, you're welcome to stay here and we can chat a bit longer. Let me just mention that in 2 weeks, again, it's Mark Braverman. And again, thanks to Bernhard. I hope to see you again for the last talk of the fall. So now we go offline, and you're welcome to stay and we can chat a bit longer. Thank you.
Thank you.